for everybody here and also everybody that's watching. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Happy Saturday morning. My name is Mark Binate. I'm with Borderlands Theater and also here with members of Teatro Bravo in Phoenix. We are working together, Teatro Bravo and Borderlands Theater, on a project, Antigone at the Border. You may have seen a virtual version of that production back in November through a New England Foundation for the Arts National Theater Project grant. We received funding to further develop this piece and really devise a whole new piece that's based on that original script that we did in November, and working together along with other members of the community organization named Scholarships AZ, and to create something that still speaks to the current situation as far as the immigration policy crisis, but also speaks to a much larger question, which is what we're going to talk about today, about the sort of the vestiges, right, of colonial practices in this side of the world, and where we find ourselves. We may think that colonialism is over. There's no more colonies here, but there's something much deeper that's still left behind, and in fact probably has developed right along with the rest of our society. So I'm really happy to bring Dr. Ernesto Todd Mireles here from Prescott College. He's been an organizer for a very long time, and he teaches a lot of Mexican American studies, Chicano studies, organizing, different forms of radical thought and post-colonial theory, and so recently published a book, Insurgent Aslan. Did I get that right, Todd? But okay, I never know which word comes first. Insurgent Aslan, an excellent manual, really written for BIPOC brown folks that are looking to, that have always been looking to make changes in the way we work together in society for equality. And so I'll go ahead and pass it over to Todd. I'll let him say anything else about himself that he wants to. But really what we're going to have is a discussion about this piece, Antigone at the Border, through this post-colonial lens, and then have primarily a discussion amongst the ensemble and Todd and Dr. Mireles. But I think we'll probably let ensemble members take first crack at comments or questions, and then we'll open it up to some of the other folks. We got members of the Borderlands Theater Board, other core members of the Borderlands Theater Ensemble, and we may have other folks from Teatro Bravo joining us. So we'll try to get some open space for others outside of the immediate lead artists to make some comments or ask questions as well. Hoping to end this all in about 90 minutes, around 11:30. All right, so thanks so much for being here, Todd. Honored to have you. Take it away.
Okay, all right. It's nice to see everybody. Hello to anybody out there who's watching. Before I go any too far into it, though, I want to acknowledge a fellow Detroit Tigers fan who's on the screen. I have that almost exact same hat, sir. And so, yes, lifelong Michigander. I don't know if you're from Michigan or not, or if you've just seen the beauty of the Detroit Tigers. So awesome. All right, good. Glad. Sorry. So like Mark was saying, my name is Ernesto Mireles. I'm a professor at Prescott College. I've actually been working with Mark, or I've been following Mark. I think that's probably the best way to say that, since the early 2000s when he was doing Grito Serpentino. And so just sort of watching the trajectory of what's happening. And we've had a lot of really good conversations over the years about the kind of stuff that I think that we're going to talk about today. And so, I watched myself and my family, my wife and my daughter, our 14-year-old daughter, we watched Antigone on the Border when it came out last year, and frankly, I was blown away by a bunch of things that the play really brought, but just seeing how you were able to adapt the technology to provide that viewing experience, I thought was incredible. So, I mean, hats off to you all. I mean, really for that. I thought it was good, very, very imaginative. And, of course, the writing. Let me share my screen to you. I do have like a PowerPoint I want to use to sort of go through the conversation. Um, Antigone at the Border, Indigenous Liberation and Resistance Writing. I chose this picture, this particular spot, because there's this confrontation between Antigone and Creon, and it's sort of a pivotal moment in the whole play where both of them are very frank with each other. They're speaking, truthfully, and this is where Antigone is really taking her stance and telling Creon that that she's willing to die, right? Which obviously is a foreshadowing for the end of the play. And is he prepared to kill? And I think that, kind of what we learn in the end is that Creon's not really prepared to kill, but that Antigone is prepared to die. He may have thought that he was, but I think that when we get to the end, that we see that he's not. And so that sort of, makes us ask some questions about that. Now, the reason that the words indigenous liberation and resistance writing are in there is because I think that when we're confronted with a piece of work like this, one of the things that we really have to keep in mind is that, regardless or irregardless, I should say, of the debates that are raging around the use of the term indigenous right now, particularly as it pertains to maybe say like the Mexican or the Chicano community, um, that what we're really talking about here is a pan-indigeneity, right? It's not located to one country or located to one type of an indigenous group, but that it's looking at indigenous liberations across the hemisphere, And so then thinking about, what that actually means as people, because part of that indigenous liberation is also the right of movement, right? The fact or yeah, the fact that we are able to move freely in lands that our ancestors did move freely in. Um, and so, that being a part of the liberation that's being talked about. The other piece is this idea of resistance writing. And so resistance writing is a very specific genre of writing that comes out of national liberation movements, right, from around the world. And so, there are several books that have been written about resistance writing. Um, the Probably the most prominent scholar of resistance writing right now is a woman named Barbara Harlow, and she talks about this genre, this writing that happens. And so the funny thing is, or I think the interesting thing is that Harlow writes her books right after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and right before, in that space in between the fall of the Berlin Wall and the emergence of the Zapatistas in 1994. And in her books, Harlow is basically saying that as a genre, resistance writing is over, right? Because it's that whole end of history, the fall of the Soviet Union, the triumph of capitalism, all of that. Um, and and then a few years after this book is published, the Zapatistas come out of the jungle. And so I think that one of the things that's really interesting in thinking about that is sort of the dismissal, right, of indigenous peoples in the Americas. And it will get into a little bit about what we're going to talk about in a few more slides when we start thinking about history, right? And whose history is it that we're really relating? And even in thinking about this confrontation between these two individuals, right? Um, whose history are they debating? I mean, some people would say that they're debating our history as a community. But I would offer that perhaps what they're really doing is debating the level of dismissiveness that we experience within the settler colonial history. And so I wanted to sort of kick things off with this quote from Roland Barthes. He writes that literature is not a bearer of meaning, but a critique of meaning. And so understanding, I think that our roles, as artists and our roles as scholars or whatever, is to take the things that are written and understand that those things are not what necessarily creates the reality that's around us, right? But they do allow us to critique the reality that we have around us. They allow us, and when I say reality, in some ways I'm using that word interchangeably with the word meaning, because what we're constantly doing, I think, as a species, as a community, as individuals, is trying to make meaning out of the things that we see around us, but simultaneously understanding that meaning is a group activity, right? That one person, an individual, a sole person cannot create meaning on their own, but that meaning, right? And I think this is why Barthes is saying that literature is a critique of meaning, right? Because meaning or reality, right? These are shared agreements that we have among ourselves. And so I think it's always interesting, when people say, well, that's not a part of my culture, this violence or whatever, that's not a part of my culture. But it actually is, right? And and being able to like understand the difference between it being a part of our reality or part of our culture and us agreeing with it, right, are that's an important distinction. And so, when we or as we go through this, and as we read the words that are on the page, as we begin to watch the play unfold, I mean, the big thing that we understand is that this is a critique. It's always a critique, right? And it's trying to like point us in a particular direction. And so yeah, we'll come back to Bart's. But I want to play a couple of clips. There's going to be a couple of clips from the play, and I think we should just listen to them and then think about how they fit into what it is that we're talking about. Here, Creon is talking to Mona. They're having a discussion about duty and about family, and yeah, and this is what he says.
Haven't you figured it out, daughter? Fear runs the world. It's what brings people across that line. It's why my job was created. It's why you're here now. You have a good family, a good job, respect, membership. That's what life is, Mona. Belonging. You see the opposite in the faces of every ignorant nobody you arrest, reminding you membership can be taken away. We do what we do so that we can come home, take the uniform off, crack open a beer, fire up the grill, kids in the pool, sun in the sky. And that ain't bad. Not at all.
No, that's that's not bad, right? And I think that what we begin to see here is that Creon has made a choice, right? Um, and part of that is is buying into this idea of fear, which actually I think, if you really think about it, right? Um, Fear can be a byproduct of a lot of different things, but for many people, fear is a byproduct of their inability to articulate their desires, right? Because they're afraid, and they don't want to say. Creon doesn't necessarily have that problem here, right? He's not afraid to articulate his desire, right? His desire for kids in the pool and sun in the sky and cracking open a beer, and they're going to have this barbecue. He wants to belong because he sees what happens when you don't belong. I think the other thing that's really important to take away from this is that he's also very clear that membership can be taken away, right? That this isn't something that you're born into necessarily, because even with that, you know, that the privileges of membership, right, can be stripped, and we see this very clearly at the end, right? Creon's membership is revoked at the end of this play. And so, you know, when we start thinking about this whole idea of desire, right? This idea of resistance to what's being to what it is that you desire. And so kind of play along with me here for a minute. We're think about Antigone and the conversation that her and Creon are having from that picture that I showed you at the beginning when she's in the holding cell, right? And Antigone has a deep resistance to Creon, okay? But she also deeply desires to belong, right? That's where this resistance stems from. It stems from her desire to belong. She wants to be she wants to be a citizen, right? She wants to be part of this. She wants to live from free from fear, right? And she wants other people to have that too. But it comes down to this desire to belong, right? The same thing that Creon is articulating right now. And so, I mean, you could even I think make the argument that her desire uh, to resist this thing, that like her desire for this thing is so strong that that is one of the reasons why she kills herself in the end, is because she desires it so greatly, right? That it's the ultimate act of resistance to this thing that she wants, but that in some ways it appears throughout the play that she's fighting against, right? When she has this confrontation with Creon, there are moments where it's all like where you have to ask yourself, what's your end game here, right? Like what is the thing that you're really going for, you know? And then, you know, of course, Creon is like, hey, just give in, just do this. You can have these things, right? But she resists them, and she resists them to the end. And so then the question I think that's important to ask is, what is it that Creon's resisting, right? Because it's also important to remember that Creon, he's not just Creon, right? He represents something much much bigger than just that one individual, right? Because all literature is a critique of meaning, right? So Antigone isn't just Antigone, Creon just isn't Creon, right? And Mona isn't just Mona, and Nices isn't just Nices, right? They represent broad categories of people. And so, I mean, as we're thinking about it that way, I mean, to think about who is Creon, you know, I'll be real honest with you. The more I watched this play, the more times I watched it, and I've watched it a bunch of times now. Um, the more sympathetic that I become towards Creon. And not because I think that Creon's a nice guy, because I don't particularly think that Creon's a nice guy, but there is a sadness that is encapsulated in his actions, in his being, right? That is that's unmistakable. But you know, he and we'll see in a slide a little bit later. I mean, he bet his money on this horse a long time ago, and he's not going to get off that ride. So when we start thinking about the way that Creon is talking, when we start thinking about this idea of the critiquing meaning, right? I want to turn real briefly to Franz Fanon. Fanon was a anti-colonial writer. He's originally from Martinique. He ended up in France during World War II, fighting for the French against the Nazis. He later, after that, or during that time, became friends with the existentialist philosophers, particularly Jean-Paul Sartre, sorry. And He goes on to write a number of books. Perhaps I think his most famous book is Wretched of the Earth, which is a book that details the necessity of resistance to colonial domination, right? And so Fanon is probably the most famous for his defense of violence and saying that the colonized themselves have the right to defend themselves by any means necessary to overthrow colonialism. And I think that he creates a very eloquent rationale and defense for that. But what a lot of people don't realize is that, or they don't really talk about because they're really hung up on the violence thing, which I think is an interesting thing to get hung up on. That Fanon talks a lot about culture, right? And because what Fanon is saying, and if you look at most anti-colonial writers, Cabral, Fanon, Mao, all of these people who have conducted successful national liberation movements, they all situate culture, right, or strong or cultural expressions as key to the ending of colonialism in their countries, right? Sorry. So what Fanon is saying is that there are three phases of literature that the natives go through, and that the very first phase, he says that the native intellectual gives proof that he is assimilated. And he writes, and the things that he writes, he's copying the colonizer, and he's writing these things, and it's just like the stuff that they're producing. It's the natives' way of saying, "See, look, we're smart like you are," right? In the second phase, though, Fanon writes, we find the native is disturbed, and he decides to remember who he is. Okay, and so then this is that period where people are starting to write about they're starting to write about the community. Okay, like these are our stories, and this is the things that we do, and we can really see the last 50, 60 years of literature, right, really sort of reflects that kind of that way of thinking, right? Nothing wrong with it. I mean, it's a phase, it's a stage that we have to go through. But what he talks about now is the third phase, right, which Fanon calls the fighting phase. And he says the native, having tried to lose himself in the people and with the people, will on the contrary shake the people. And then he says that he will produce hence comes a fighting literature, a revolutionary literature, and a national literature. There's during this phase, a great many men and women who up till then would have never thought of producing a literary work, right, find themselves doing these different things. And so I think that part of what we do as we approach pieces like this is really think about, I mean, what part of this are we in, with Antigone on the border? I mean, I would argue that we're absolutely in the third phase, right? That we're having a discussion because, I mean, if you think about it, how you as artists, right, or even how I as a scholar are going to write about this, or how you're going to produce this play, it the perspective or the context within which it's produced totally changes the outcome of the effort, right? So I mean, if this is a play where we're saying to dominant society, hey, look how you treat us, look how you make us act, or how you make us treat each other, you should be ashamed of yourself, right? Which is certainly a legitimate thing to do. Or is this a play that says to other Latinos who are watching, hey man, hey, what are you doing, right? What are you doing to stop this, right? Who is Creon, right? I mean, I would argue that Creon, I don't think that he's just the guy that runs the border patrol, right? He's much bigger. And so then the question, right, then becomes, what are we doing? Is this a national literature? Is this a revolutionary literature? Is it a fighting literature? What does that even mean for it to be a fighting literature? I think that these are questions, right, that have to be answered as we think about how to like present this to other people, you know. Let's see, let's go on here. And so I have another little clip for you. And I want you to, as we're listening to this, I want you to think about why it's important to frame our writing or our work, the work that we do outside of settler colonialism and inside of our desire for liberation, right? So understanding that in reality, we can never step outside of the context that we live in. Like we can't divorce ourselves from our everyday context or our everyday reality. But we can say, okay, wait a minute, what does it look like if I move over here, right? How is it that our desire for liberation, whatever that means to you, right? Because I mean, I'll go back to what I said earlier. I think that liberation for a lot of people means that they can move unimpeded any place that they want to. I think that's a part of liberation, right? Being able to have enough food to eat, being able to have a place to live, being able to travel unrestricted, right? Because brown bodies in the Americas cannot travel unrestricted. Other bodies can, right? But brown skinned bodies cannot. They cannot travel unrestricted. There is a thing that stops them. And that thing isn't just a wall or a fence, right? It's a mentality that's created through this structure of settler colonialism that says this space right here, this isn't for you. This space doesn't belong to you. It only belongs to you if we let you into it, right? And so let's take a look at this this little clip.
¡Maravillas! ¡Y terrores!
Del mundo son mucho, pero nada comparan honores con los seres humanos, cabrones. Más chuco que el chuco, con fuerza y pasión, más chingón, reinador de este mundo, maestro de todo, el mar, las montañas, las armas, ¡qué jodo! Humanidad, conquistando y desarrollando la modernidad, sus bombas atómicas, capitalismo, la fe y sus grandes dicotomías. Say my name! Antropólogos dicen que I'm at the top of the chain. Civilization creation. Yo, son, I build nations. Industrial coup? Then I sell it to you con inflation. I got a first-rate reputation. Cures for disease. Well, pharmaceutical empires keep us alive, so bitch, please. Humanidad domina todo excepto la muerte. Y con tantos recursos de naturaleza y mente con suerte, a veces son justos. Más veces son mal y de malas. Y con leyes divinas dibujas las líneas sobre sus arenas morales. Balancing act. Tienes que choose. In order to win, how much are you willing to lose? Y cuando al fin te das cuenta, te caerás de rodillas, despertando to find the American dream fue solo una gran pesadilla.
I really liked that part. The
Me too.
yeah. So I mean, when we think about it, right, in and what we come to understand is that every as we exist within this critique, right? I mean, because we can certainly see the critique there, and we see how important the critique is, right? Thinking about what it means to produce, what it means to create, you know, as intentionally as possible outside of this framework of settler colonialism, right? To refocus our work, not to the first and the second phase where we say, hey, look at, we can do it just like you can, or let me tell you this story, right? But to say, and we're not really talking to you right now. What we're doing is we're having like an A and B conversation, right? So, you know, you're going to have to wait until that conversation is over, because the question, right, always becomes, and as we look at like this and we think about the things that Creon is saying, right, he's talking about power, and he's talking about belonging, you know, and he's talking about, you know, all of the things that he has to lose within this context, right? And then there's a part at the end where Antigone is saying, you know, she's riding in the bus on the way to the detention center, and she has this like little like soliloquy. I think that it is, where she's saying that, you know, in spite of you, we live, we have barbecues, we have children, we have all that. But at the end of each one of those sentences, you know, she punctuates that with the word power, right? And yeah, that is a certain type of power, that power of like daily resistance, you know, like we're gonna keep on going no matter what. But that's not the kind of power that Creon's talking about, right? That's not the kind of power that that that's the kind of power of resistance, but it's not the kind of power that ends that oppression, right? It's not the kind of power that brings people back, or um, that truly confronts a power structure like settler colonialism, and confronts it in a way that it could conceivably end it, right? Important, you know, it's a potential, right? That's what is being articulated there. It's the potential for power, right? The promise of liberation, but not the actual thing itself. And so I want to just give you this real quick. Um, there's a very interesting essay that's written by this man named E.L. Katzenbach. He was an assistant Secretary of State in the Kennedy administration. His brother was like an attorney general or something like that. And Katzenbach became sort of an expert on Mao Zedong. And he wrote this piece that was called Space Plus Time Equals Will, the political military theories of Mao Zedong. That was the name of the essay. And it only goes to show how much of a nerd I am that I totally remember the name of this essay. But basically in this piece that he writes, what Katzenbach says is that Western military theorists have devoted themselves to a certain way of thinking about warfare that has to do with manpower, logistics, and now I can't remember what the third one is, right? But that Mao, because China was a very poor country, right, had to think about how he conducted war in terms of space, time, and will. In other words, the trading of space for the time, for enough time to develop the will of the people, right? And what Katzenbach says is that these are the intangibles of warfare, right? And so when we think about our own situation, right, we live in a hemisphere, we live in land that is conquered, right? There is no space for us to give up. The space has been, it's been given, it's been taken. It's been taken to the extent that we can't even actually freely travel, right? I mean, that's how taken the space is. So if we want to think about this particular equation and how it might pertain to what we're thinking about here, we have to think about spaces, I argue anyways, as intellectual spaces, right? So you get this, and I think that this is where these ideas of like, not where they come from, but where, you know, the word Hispanic or the word Latino, right? These are spaces that we occupy politically, because we do. And as those spaces develop, right, they also are threatened to be overcome by, you know, by settler colonialism, right? Because that's what settler colonialism does. It finds a way to adapt. And so we roll through these spaces, right? And so we were Chicanos with a CH, and then we became Chicanos with an X, right? And then we were Latinos, and then we became Latinx, right? These are spaces that we occupy. These are spaces that we move through. And we take that space, right? And we give up that space when the time is appropriate for time, right? Because it's always a conversation that's happening within the community. And that conversation, right, is building the will of the people to resist. And so when we think about it, like, we understand how this term works in terms of culture. It works for where we're at, that we have these spaces that we occupy, that we occupy them, right? Because what it does as we move through each space, as we leave Chicano with a CH and move into Chicano with an X, right? What it does is it staves off, or it fends off that final moment of assimilation, right? As we begin to move through, you know, and then this is where words like indigenous come in, and where words like, you know, nation come in, right? What we're looking for, I think, is a space that's big enough to hold all of those things together at one time, right? And then when we finally find that space, then we look and we see what the will of the people, really is. And so the question, and I think that this is an important one, right? Is what will that moment bring, right? Because I think that's still a coin toss for most of the people in the community. And I think that the discussion, part of the discussion that's happening in here is, I think it's why it's important that we situate it back within the community, because it is a coin toss. What is it going to be? You know, is it Creon? You know, is it Antigone? You know, is it Mona? You know, I mean, these are all questions, right? That we have to figure out how to deal with. Amilcar Cabral, who is the leader of the National Liberation Movement in Guinea-Bissau, he very smart man. You know, also wrote a tremendous amount on culture. The part that I want to really show you or bring your attention to is the part that's in red. And this is a speech that he gave at the Tricontinental Congress in Cuba in 1966. And the title of the speech is called The Weapon of Theory. And what Cabral says is that on the basis of this, we can see that national liberation is the phenomenon in which a given socioeconomic whole rejects the negation of its historical process, right? In other words, national liberation is this thing, it's a thing, right? Phenomenon, it's a thing in which, where it says socioeconomic whole, these people, whoever they are, reject the elimination of their history. In other words, the national liberation of a people is the regaining of the historical personality of that people. It is a return to history through the destruction of the imperialist domination to which it was subjected. Now, what this tells us, I think, at least in Cabral's estimation, is that the history that we live in right now is not our history. The history that we live in right now is the history of the settler. And so when we have these arguments, when we have these debates with each other, what we are debating is settler history, right? Now that doesn't give any of us a pass in terms of like, what are we going to do about it, or, you know, how do we fit into it? But I think it does help us to maintain a realistic vision about what it is that we're actually opposing, right? What it is that we're actually against, and what the goal is. What does it mean to return to history? It means that we regain a historical personality, right? And, you know, and so, and how does that happen? Well, Cabral says it's through the destruction of the imperialist domination, right? Fanon says the same thing. They all say the same thing. The only way for colonized people to return to history is to overthrow settler colonialism. Now they did it their way. That was, you know, in the middle of the 20th century. Maybe it'll be different for us. Maybe things will be different. Who knows? The way that, you know, capitalism is imploding on itself, or I should say the way that it's imploding the planet, I think will have severe repercussions for everybody in the next 20 or 30 years. But it doesn't change the fact, right, that this conversation is, or this history that we're living, it isn't our history yet, right? That we haven't returned to that. And so you know, thinking about what these things mean, and I think also thinking about, you know, the role that the scholar or the artist plays in really pushing these forward, right, in the different projects that we undertake. You know, I really thought that this slide really fit in here when I made this, but now that we're going through this, I don't know if it fits as well. But I will say this: Professor Ronaldo Macias, Dr. Macias, he's a professor of Chicano Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. He has written a lot about this subject of Chicano Studies, and Professor Macias basically is saying, and I'm taking a whole bunch of stuff that he's saying and really boiling it down. He's saying that there are three questions that that Chicano Studies really deals with, right? And that the first one is, who are we, right? The second is, what is our material situation and condition? And the third is, what can we do about it? And I think that as we look at a lot of, or most, a lot of cultural production by Chicanos and other Latinos, right? That these are the questions really that they're wrestling with. And I think these are the questions that Antigone at the Border is really wrestling with. You know, who are we, right? I mean, that one's, even if nobody says it explicitly, I mean, the dialogue between everyone from the opening scene with the sisters, right? Do you think your gringo's going to save you? You know, I mean, who are we? You know, what is our material situation and condition? I mean, we look at the way that all of the siblings die in this play, right? And they all answer that question. You know, from Nieces, right, who dies trying to cross back over, you know, as a drug mule, and then is murdered, you know, but murdered with his brother, you know, in the desert. And then the final question, you know, what can we do about it, right? I think that these are also, this is also reflective or reminiscent of Fanon's fighting stage, right? This is where we're at. Okay, these are the questions that we're dealing with. And so, you know, a big part of it is, you know, what's our ultimate outcome? You know, I mean, do we ask these questions and do we do all of this simply because we desire greater participation in settler colonialism in a history that isn't really our history, you know? Or is there a, you know, is there something else? And I think that yeah, these are ideas to keep in mind. So we talk about internal colonialism. It says that the main difference between neo-colonialism and internal colonialism is the source of exploitation. In the former, the control comes from outside the nation state, while in the latter, it comes from within. And so I would argue that we're in a situation of internal colonialism, and that we've been colonized on our land, and that the people who have colonized us now claim this as a homeland, right? Like this is where they're from. And so this is part of the discussion. And that's why I put the Cabral quote there. The national liberation of a people is the regaining of the historical personality of that people, and is a return to history through the destruction of the imperialist domination to which they have been subjected. And so I think that it's interesting, you know, that lots of times when we have this conversation, sometimes people get really uncomfortable because they can only imagine that what we're talking about is a flip-flopping of positions where brown faces are on top and other faces are on the bottom, and that, you know, somehow we would, that our goal is to build a society that mirrors the one that they built in terms of oppression and the way that, you know, that we've been treated. And I don't necessarily think that that's true at all, right? And it's certainly not a fated or a foregone conclusion. You know, as we could say that, uh, like the fate of many of the people in this play. So we're almost to the end. I mean, who is Creon Cardenas? You know, I would argue that Creon Cardenas is the 60 million people, Chicanos, Latinos, Mexicanos, whoever, however you want to say it, in this country, who are citizens, who just sit by and watch all of this just happen. I mean, let let's you know, let's be honest with each other. The majority of us don't do anything about this at all. I mean, the true heroes of their own story are the DACA kids, the undocumented kids, right? I mean, they are out there scrapping every day for their lives, for their future, right? And the vast majority, the overwhelming majority, it's the preponderance of us are not engaged in the struggle in any way, shape, or form, right? And and I think, you know, that some people may say, well, then that doesn't make us Creon because Creon is actively blocking. But I would argue that it does, that is who Creon represents. Because if we're not actively doing something, then I'm sorry, but we're actively blocking the progress of the people who are working towards this. I mean, I refuse to believe that there are 60 million of us and that we could not get these kids out of cages if we didn't really want to. I don't think I think that that's not possible, right? But what that goes back to is this idea of power, right? What kind of power do we have? I mean, sure, we have the kind of power that Antigone is talking about, and there's something heroic about that, right? There's no question about that. That that yeah, that the you know, the power that comes up from resisting, you know, from being alive, you know, for survival, right? Which is also a theme that Creon Cardenas repeats numerous times throughout the play, talking about it's a matter of survival, right? But this is a different kind of power, right? The kind of power that it takes to bring those kids out of cages is a political power that comes from an intentional organizing, that comes from I think partially, you know, having this internal conversation, right? That stems from this fighting phase. It comes from being able to critique a reality and to understand that the work that we're involved in is a critique of reality. It's a deep critique of it, right? To constantly be asking ourselves the questions: who are we? What is our material situation and condition, right? What can we do about it? And then to think about how it is that we begin to build organization. Because even though the quotes that I showed you don't explicitly say it, but if you want to return to history, what do you return to history as? I mean, does Ernesto Mireles return to history, right? Does Mark Piñate turn to history? No, we return to history, right? We return as a group. We return as a formation, right? Because individuals, this isn't the kind of work that individuals um, can do. This is work that has to be done by large groups of people. I don't oppose and end settler colonialism. I may oppose it in my life, but I don't end it, right? That's something that we do as a group. And I think it's a powerful argument to say who Creon Cardenas is, because we also perpetuate it as a group, right? I mean, you or we or us or I think we could make the argument right now. Like if we stopped working for settler colonialism, right? If we stopped guarding the borders, right? If we stopped um, picking up the trash, man, if we stopped watching people's kids, you know, I mean, if we just stopped, what would happen? I mean, everything would come to a grinding halt, right? I mean, we are the ones that make this country work. I mean, because we're the ones that do the work. We're the ones that pick the food, right? We're the ones that plant the food. We're the ones that pull the milk out of the cows. I mean, that is the work of our community. And you look at the death tolls that have accumulated over the past year from COVID, and you see how hard hit the Latino community is, right? And that's because we're still out there working. So there's a part of this that we have to accept responsibility for, but it has to be accepted in a way that also includes, right, our political responsibility to building power, right, to building power organizationally. You know, when Creon says, I put my money on this horse a long time ago, right, what he's talking about is the system of power that is in place. That's the horse that Creon is riding, right? And he put his money on that because he saw no credible alternatives to that power structure. None. Which is why he buys into it, which is why most people buy into it, right? And people who don't buy into it, we think they're crazy. We think there's something wrong with them, right? I mean, even as I was watching this, I was like, Antigone, what are you doing? You know, there's a part of me that was just like, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? You know? And so we have these decisions. I think they're clear in some ways, but they have to be fleshed out. They have to be thought through. You know, culture and politics are inseparable. They cannot exist independently. They cannot exist independently. I do not believe that you can have a cultural production that is free from politics, and that politics stem from what is cultural. The way that we embrace our politics, the way that we produce our politics. I mean, everybody spent the last 4 years talking about what an aberration Donald Trump is, but actually Donald Trump isn't really an aberration at all. He is an articulation, right, of a very persistent and long-term thread of thinking that has happened within the United States. But that's not aberrant. I mean, it's there, and it's always been there from the very beginning. From the first time that somebody killed a native for their land, that is when that way of thinking has been produced. So these two ideas, culture and politics, inseparable from each other. Let's see here. Yeah, let's watch this clip real quick. This is the last idea that I want to leave you with is this idea of heightening contradictions. And then, you know, Mao writes that all processes have a beginning and an end. All processes transform themselves into their opposites. The constancy of the process is relative, but the mutability manifested in the transformation of one process into another is absolute. So no matter how long it takes for one thing, for one process to change, to transform itself, it will happen. It doesn't matter how long it takes, it will happen. And we see the same thing within ourselves, within our community, right? There is a process of transformation that is going on. And then we have to think through that. And so as I play this, I thought that this was actually I think that this really summed up a lot of this idea.
Lucky are they that have never known the full weight of evil barred down on them. The lung-crushing feeling of hopelessness resolved to meet a savage death,
whose history has not trembled at the gods of war and commerce, terrorized too much
by typhoons of fate and folly that transmuted 10,000 forests of milk and honey
to a scourge of all-consuming fires of
fear
and coercion.
Pandora's box of first encounters run around these western shores of hope and fortune. What primordial?
Maude
Oho looks upon the children of Pakal and Moctezuma. What is
this curse?
passed down generation after generation?
Smallpox,
Influenza, conquest, broken treaty, trail of broken treaty, tears they got us with the
Christian God mission system. Hacienda peasantry like never-ending fields of sugarcane, United Fruit, the Civil War, the CIA, and Pinochet.
Matanza killing fields, Batista, Sandinista, Contras, crack cocaine, and Sinaloa syndicate. Naftaladora murders to build the wall of zero tolerance.
And now these dreamers deferred,
Left blowing in winds of politics.
Hung out to dry by empty shows of force.
The great God global capitalism dictates immutable laws of economics. The ACLU cannot combat any more than Homeland Security. But the law of truth decrees that which rises must also fall.
So the first shall be last,
And the last
First.
So it's this through this tightening of contradictions, right? Which I think is something that's absolutely present in this particular piece. I mean, I think it's foundational to it, but I think it's foundational to. I mean, this is just my own personal opinion. I think it's foundational to any good art or theater or movies. But it's the exposing contradictions between opposing groups is based on the fundamental belief in the irreconcilable differences in the values, beliefs, and most of all interest between those two groups. And if we think right about the pieces that we've gone through, I mean, we begin to see the irreconcilable differences between what we would call Mesoamerican society and Western society. Is the fact that Mexican anthropologist Guillermo Bonfil Batalla, in his book Mexico Profundo, writes that there is a permanent confrontation between Mesoamerican civilization and Western civilization in the Americas, and that confrontation will exist until one of those emerges triumphant. But as long as we continue to have these types of conversations, as long as we continue to produce this type of material, right? What we're doing is situating ourselves within that confrontation, on a side of that confrontation. And so then the second part here is, in view of race, class, political, and economic interests, can any institution be viewed as neutral, right? And then we have to ask ourselves the same question. In view of our race, class, political, and economic interests, can we be viewed as neutral? And so thinking through this, this heightening of contradictions. And then this is my final slide to you all. What is the contradiction? And that's my presentation. Or at least that's that part of it.
Right on. Thank you, Ernesto. I call him Todd because that's his middle name, and his professional name is Dr. Ernesto Mireles.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, and lots to think about, and some great, some great, we the artists. Some of us here were at the core of that production, and very deeply involved in it. And I think you had obviously thought about it months and months, but that it's great that some of the points that you bring up, I think even still give me a fresh perspective or some food for thought that I hadn't thought of, as the creator of this work. And certainly this idea of intentionality and who is this piece going to be for that you brought up is something moving forward that I think the team really is going to have some good discussions about. And so at this point, for the half hour that we have left, I want to open up first to the core artistic team So Anya Hernandez, Adam Cooper Teran, Ricky Araiza, and myself. If there's any comments or questions or something that popped up, and then and let's just spend a few minutes with that. And then if there's other folks on this call that have some comments or want to say something, that I think there's probably some time for that. Yeah, so anybody on the core team? I mean, I could say things, but I don't want to take up all the time.
Still brewing, still marinating.
Yeah,
it is a lot to take in, and I'm so grateful for all of it. Yeah, I would just reflect on my experience listening to this. I just felt such a deep conviction of, like, when you ask, what are you doing? And like, I felt it emotionally in my body of what are we doing in this scope? And that gives me a lot of hope for this piece. If I have that response in an informational setting, what happens when we address these issues in an artistic way and in a poetic way? What response is that going to elicit in an audience? And so I'm coming away from this conversation with a lot of things to think about and to question, but mostly just a lot of hope.
Yeah, I think to go off that, this conversation today reminded me of conversations that we had at the end of our first run of this with the organization that we did. And there were moments where I felt, oh, there were some blind spots, or there were who was this for? And even just narrative choices that was like, wow, okay, like what contrasting the narrative that we created and displayed as opposed to like some narratives that were actually happening not far off. But I think there was it was a lot of like reminding myself, yeah, who is this for, and what is the perspective that we're going to really center in this, and where are our blind spots still? And I think that's something, yeah, that I'm always thinking about.
I think that, like, the who is it for, Ernesto mentions, that, like, there's a conversation from indigenous or people of color to, to white folks or the colonizer, and I think that's certainly not the case in what this piece is. But I think within brown folks, there's people with citizenship and people that don't have citizenship. And I think, from the conversation we had with some folks from Scholarships AZ, people in that undocumented situation, it was not so much a discussion between us and them. It was more a discussion between us and brown citizens, right? People, and what are you doing? What are we doing or not doing, right? And so that is really, it's been interesting working with Scholarships AZ, and because the things we're planning to do with them don't necessarily have a direct like input into this piece, again, because it's not for them. We're not saying anything, and they're doing things. They're at the front lines. There's no need to motivate them or create a will in them. It's there. It's like everyone else, like, to create that will. And so it's been interesting, working on some like digital storytelling workshops with their folks, the people they serve, and injecting artists into their organization to amplify projects they're already working on. And I think that some of that work or that exposure to that community by persons like me, that I am a citizen, I hope will bleed into somehow this work of art, right? That it's not necessarily like we're not doing a play about Scholarships AZ, or but that there's something that I necessarily can't put words on, an essence,
spirit,
that will make its way into this other piece that's not a direct way. Like, I'm going to interview you, and I'm going to take this interview from you, undocumented person. I'm going to put it in the play, and everyone's going to know now, right?
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of questions around the intentionality of, I think, of anyone that's like wanting to do work with a specific framework in mind, that in that way of discussing how time and space equals will, like, for me personally as a creative, like I try to consider also, like, again, like the spirit of the, from myself, but like what is the spirit that I'm trying to invoke or put into the piece, and how that kind of becomes a guiding principle that adds to the will of a piece, or of a work, that ultimately, if like the factors are right and the intentions are pure, my experience with this is that can resonate and impact culture and transform culture, and can transform individuals, who can then add to like this wave that can make actual change occur. And it's not just about making art per se either. Yeah, like how can creative people use this? Not just, most creative people might fall into spaces where they need to entertain, but I think the real craft is like blending all the tactics of entertainment and subverting them with actual politics and actual intention, and then that's how you can kind of like change people's minds, or get them kind of like thinking about things that they never thought about before. So yeah, I appreciate you with contextualizing all of this, Dr. Mireles. I want to be very receptive to how this translates to the next phase of this work.
There's something interesting about embodying it, and how that sits, and how that moves the one's, like, your own personal spirit, and how you're unpacking truths for yourself, which I think, as a performer director on this piece, co-director on this piece, that's the nerve-wracking part for me, is the embodiment, because there's a truth one has to face, and nervous but excited, right? Yeah, it's another thing thinking about.
A thought that keeps coming up, and I know I've mentioned it a little bit to some of the folks on the team, is the way that the piece ends. And the ending has been dictated by this Greek playwright from 4,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, that everybody dies. And so there's this question I have of that in this revision of the work that's already a revision of another work, but does everybody need to die, right? So if this is a conversation amongst people, brown folks with citizenship, they're just trying to fucking make it, right? Just like I got a lot of shit going on, like I got a job, I got a place to live, I got relative calm, like what the fuck more do you want from me? Like, that's, and I think that's a very valid position, right? Like there's a lot of sense in that position. But if this is a conversation between us and them, amongst us, is it more effective to say, okay, look, if you let's take that to the extreme, let's do a thought experiment, because I really think most theater is really a thought experiment, and let's take these positions to the extreme, and let's run them to the end and see what happens. Okay, well, what happens is horrible tragedy. Is that a way to, is that and I'm not saying like I need an answer today, but I'm thinking, is that a most effective way? Or do people not die, and there's some sort of like more upbeat, victorious, like modeling what should happen? But then I feel like you run into, some people want to start calling that didactic, right? And there's a lot of stuff, like that term itself, I notice, comes from a lot of white mainstream theater people about most work by BIPOC, that once you start trying to teach a lesson or something,
right?
Oh, God forbid, now it's didactic. So now it's already it's like no good, right? Now you're trying to teach me something. You're trying to agit propaganda, blah, blah, blah. And so you have to stay clear of like any clear message like that. So I don't know. I don't know what folks think about that. Or Dr. Mireles, what do you think about that?
I mean, I think that it's that the double standard there is amazing, right? Because that's really in all, I mean, literature. I mean, even in this written by this Greek guy, I mean, there's a lesson here, right? Don't be an asshole. I mean, and so they produce white artists, white scholars. I mean, it's the same thing in the academy, right? Well, you can do research, but you can't do research on your own community, right? I mean, that's all white people do is research on their own community. I mean, unless they're writing about who we are, right? But we can't write about who we are. No, I think, yeah, that's what I think about that.
I have something to say about that. I think if it's artfully done and if it's nuanced, then I think no one will say that. But I also think that what you're talking about, Mark, has more to do with what people consider is a good play. And a lot of that is based on Western theater ideals of what a good play is and what nuances are within a play. So I think if it's artfully done, people aren't going to say that. And some people may still say that because of the way that we carry ourselves may not be in the nuanced way that Western theater culture carries themselves. You know what I'm saying? Like, by nature, I feel like people of color are a little bit more expressive in the way that we speak and that sort of thing. But I don't think that it's didactic to have a message. I can think of a lot of plays that are about Anglos, and they all have messages. Like Todd said, I agree. All pieces of theater, whether it's blatantly said or not. I think that's what it comes back to, is like, are we blatantly like saying a message? Then people might say it's didactic, and I don't know how I personally feel about that. But I think if it's like what Adam said, it's within the art, it's entertaining, for me, it's planting a seed of hope or a seed of joy.
Right.
And it doesn't necessarily mean that, everything's tied up in a bow at the end. It just means that we can see elements of possibilities that could be. And that, I think, is very inspiring for all types of people.
Yeah, there's some, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, go ahead. And then there's a couple comments on our Facebook that I want to get to, but go ahead, Ricky.
No, I just wanted to reiterate, like to go off what you said. Like, there's something so enticing about joy as an act of a resistance, and joy and hope as an act of resistance and resilience. And I feel like there's some interesting possibility about it taking that kind of turn, and not, if it doesn't rely on the tragic, like where everyone dies.
Yeah, I'm like thinking about the residue we leave with people from this piece. And there's resolution, happy ending of joy and strength. And then there's an energized hope for change and will for action type of joy. And so finding that nuance, like you were saying, is a challenge, but I think it's worth it to leave an audience feeling like, yeah, we can do this. We can make change happen. And not necessarily feel, have them leaving just like angry and upset about what the situation is, but we want them to feel empowered to do something about it.
I think residue is a really good word. I do, because, when Antigone kills herself at the end, I mean, and for those who know the story, I mean, we know that this is how the story ends, right? But in this context, I think in the time that we live in now, in the 21st century, there is a residue of hopelessness that comes with that. That is just, it's almost unbearable. I mean, really, to think that Yeah, that was rough. That part was hard for me when they did that, because I just was so, it was so sad, you know. So yeah, I feel that word residue. I think that's a good word.
I want to also just I want to thank Milta Ortiz, core ensemble member, for jumping in, and if any, Veronica, also a core ensemble member, or Todd Polstra, board member, if you guys have anything, comments or questions. But Milta, you want to read those couple comments?
Sure. So the first one was during your presentation, Todd, and I just want to share it with y'all. So it's from Luke Salcido, and it says, I'm feeling like saying, this is not our history, does not have room for accountability. Also, to say that we need to go back to our history feels unrealistic and based in purity politics.
So this isn't our history. I mean, but that doesn't mean that we're not accountable, and we're accountable to return to history. We're accountable to build organization. We're accountable to combat injustice. I mean, we're accountable. This conversation is an act of accountability in terms of thinking about how it is that we want to bring this message, right? Whatever the part of the message is that you're bringing. I mean, I brought a certain part of the message today, right? But everybody that's here has a piece of that message that they take forward. But it is not our history. We live in the history of the colonizer. And I realize that for some people that might be upsetting, but that doesn't mean it's not true. The other part is that I never said that we return to our past history. What I said was that we return to history, and that we do that as a group, as a national grouping. And those are very, very different things. In no way, shape, or form do I think that the history that has been disrupted can be regained, or even should be regained. I do not think that, right? But I do think that we as a group of people have the right to self-determination and to sovereignty, and to, you know, even it's something as simple as being able to travel wherever we want to, right? And so yeah, because I read the comment too, but I think that accountability is there. I don't think it has to do with purity politics at all. I mean, at least in my mind, for me personally, it doesn't have anything to do with purity politics. I don't think there's anything pure about my politics.
Okay, thank you for that. And here is another comment by Leanne Hernandez. And she says, really interesting, given that we also have these conversations in colonial tongues. Makes me wonder how to write and create outside of the settler colonial framework, given the entrenchment.
Well, I gotta go learn now what. Let's go.
I mean, we could learn Nawa, we could learn Taramuhara, we could learn, you know, Urumpecha. I mean, there's all kinds of languages that we could learn. I think that and I don't say that to dismiss this comment. I think it's a very valid point, right? Because we are having these conversations in colonial tongues, which I think is just even more proof that we live in the history of the colonizer, because we speak their language, right? We think their thoughts. I started this presentation about indigenous liberation with a quote from Roland Barthes, right? Who's some French dude, right? Who I actually happen to think is really smart, and I really like him, but, you know, why didn't I start it with, you know, an indigenous philosopher? Why didn't I start it with Bonfil Bataille? You know, I mean, we all got like this stuff inside us that we have to overcome, right? I think that the last part of it though, this is the part, and I'll tell you, sister, that when I'm in class with my students, this is the part that we really try to like struggle with, right? That how to write and create outside of the settler colonial framework, given the entrenchment. And I think the only way to do that, right, is that, because I don't think that you can actually do it. I think the only way to approach it is to intentionally say, okay, I'm going to end this story. What does Antigone look like if we give it an indigenous ending, right? Like, and because I don't know what an indigenous ending is, right? But I do know that if we sit and we think about it, right, that we can come up with an ending that's different, right? That speaks more to, you know, maybe we want to use, like I was saying in the chat, maybe we want to use the Nahualin framework, right? Think about Tezcatlipoca, Quetzalcoatl, Huitzilopochtli, and Xipi-Totec, right? Reflection, knowledge, action, and then, you know, transformation. To think about the story in a circular manner as opposed to a linear manner, right? There's just we can do it. It doesn't mean that we're escaping it, because history tells us there's only one way to escape settler colonialism, and that is to destroy the imperialist domination to which we have been subjected, right? This play won't do that. The poem I write won't do that, right? Or my book, the book I wrote won't do that. But what it does do is add to the conversation, like the brother was saying earlier, right? And so that, you know, you have this cultural groundswell that leads us maybe to this inevitable spot. Well, it's not inevitable, but it maybe leads us to this one conclusion of national liberation. That's how I would answer that question, anyways.
I want to thank Leanne for that comment. I love Leanne and Luke, also both longtime hermana y hermanos of Borderlands, and I'm glad you guys are watching today. Thank you. Anybody else on the call here got anything they want to mention or comment?
I wanted to add to Leanne's comment about we're problem solvers, right? As creators, that's our job. So that's an awesome question to just bring to the table and be like, what is the creative way to address that kind of thing, and move forward with art in just creative ways that people have never experienced before. That just adding that onto Leanne's thing, and the thing that Dr. Mireles mentioned on culture and politics, kind of being married and not being able to get away from them. I think the same with ourselves and our culture. We have all these things that we are connected to that's hard to separate ourselves from, and part of the work is addressing it and bringing it out, teasing it out, and showing it.
I would like to add to that, because Veronica, you just made me think of when I first started writing poems, people would comment about their circular nature, and I had no idea that I was doing that. And so I feel like it is in our DNA. The knowledge is in our DNA. We're just not aware of it. And it's just a matter of getting in tune with it. And I also want to note that my 8-year-old was here next to me hearing your lecture, Todd. And I'm really excited to see what the future brings, because I feel that more and more of the younger generation is hearing these things that I had no idea about until I sought them out in undergrad, and until I sought out Rasa studies, I didn't know anything about myself. And I feel like it's a different world now. So it's really exciting to see what happens in the future.
I want to take a moment and before we sign off here to just also not introduce is not the right word, but acknowledge Gertie Lopez. Gertie Lopez, she doesn't have her camera on, but she's been listening the whole time. She's on the call. She's one of the core team artists on the project. And for folks that don't know Gertie, although if you're a real Tucsonense, you should know. But she's an accordion player, member of the Tohono O'odham Nation, plays a Waila style of music that comes from the Tohono O'odham, and we're and has had a relationship with Borderlands Theater for like a couple decades, doing work with us, playing her music with her band Gertie and the T.O. Boys, used to do all the music for our annual pastorela. But I thought it was really important to bring Gertie into this this new iteration, this sort of revising of the work, because yeah, one, obviously this is the land we're on, but more than that is and it goes to this idea of pan-indigeneity or nation building, the idea that anyone from the Americas, that we are all this big giant group of people that can call this place our ancestral homelands. I think that this idea of DNA and, like, you know, that I have some Spanish blood, I think I have very little actually, but that, you know, that this idea of the mestizo, and I always think about the three faces in one from the classic 1970s Chicano arte, right? That there's the Spanish face and the indigenous face that makes the mestizo face in the middle. But, you know, I think there's a lot of problems with that. And I'm sure Dr. Mireles could to speak to that a bit, but there's something that I want to try and get, you know, it sounds trite. Oh, I want to get into my indigenous roots. And for some folks watching, I'm sure it's not trite at all. But for some folks, it is, right? Or like my father could just always just blows that off. Like, that's just ridiculous. You're not Indian, right? But like, I think I am. And this idea of being the detribalization of so many of our folks, and the fact that regardless of what your DNA makeup, if you are treated this way, your family has been treated a certain way generation after generation under this colonial regime, regardless of what amount of European blood is in you, you're part of this nation, because you're not getting any of the benefits of having any European blood in you. So I'm hoping that there's a way we can explore that in this piece. And maybe it's not like everything but the kitchen sink kind of piece by doing that, but I don't know.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yes, Gertie, yes.
Okay. Thank you for the introduction, Mark, and thank you, Dr. Ernesto, for all the information you sent to us. Like Mark said, I'm a musician, and I'm really learning a lot starting this project and being part of it. I thank you all for inviting me in, and looking forward to it. And when you all were talking, you're talking about culture and politics. And I sit back and I'm thinking, yeah, we sit around as autumn when we start talking about, you know, our own stuff, and then we always end up, and it always ends up with politic talking too. So thank you all for your time. Dr. Ernesto was very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, we're based at our time. So yeah, I just want to thank everybody for joining on the call. Dr. Mireles, for I know you put some time into this leading up to it, so I appreciate all the preparation. I want to thank the folks that watched. I know there's some other board members watching, and like I said, some past folks that have worked with us very deeply in the past. So we always appreciate that. And you know, part of this open process series, you know, we're going to keep, I think, opening this work up like this as we make it. And I want to thank Ricky actually for suggesting we live stream this conversation, because I think that is also a more indigenous or non-Western, non-colonial way of working, right? That we're not in this silo as the experts and we know everything and we're going to make this artwork. That I think the more that we can get the community, the village, right, to chime in and give us a sense of direction is going to be really helpful. So I appreciate everybody being on this first one with us. And have a great weekend, everybody.
Thanks for letting me be a part of your production. I mean, really, you have no idea how much this means to me. I had a really great time today, and so being able to like talk with you all who are actually gonna like put this together, very cool, very, very cool. So I appreciate it. All right, no,
Thank you.